So, good morning and welcome everyone to the third meeting of the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee. And can we just remind members and everyone present to turn off their mobile phones or have them on silent. My name is Margaret McDougall, MSP. I'm the Deputy Convener of Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments. So, because Stuart Stevenson hasn't arrived this morning yet, I'll be chairing the meeting this morning. We also have apologies from Fiona MacDonald. Oops, Fiona MacLeod, yes. Sorry. Okay, so the first item this morning is for the committee to decide whether it's consideration of a draft report on hybrid bills, a draft report on standing order rule changes on EU rules, and the next steps for, and a draft report on its inquiry into lobbying should be taken in private at future meetings. Do members agree? Thank you. Agenda item 2 is decision on taking business in private. Agenda item 2 is for the committee to decide whether it takes item 5 in private, which is an item for the committee to consider the next stage of its inquiry into procedures for considering legislation. Do members agree to take this item in private? Thank you. And agenda item 3 is inquiry into lobbying. Now, agenda is for the committee to take evidence on its inquiry into lobbying, and I would like to welcome our first panel today. We have JULIET SWANN, Campaigns and Research Officer for the Electoral Reform Society, Michael Clancy, Director of Law Reform, and Brian Simpson, Law Reform Officer, Law Society of Scotland, and David Robb, Chief Executive, Office of the Scottish Charity Regulator. So welcome everyone. Now, I will invite members to ask questions of the panel. And I'm going to just say initially that to welcome you all here and thank you all for taking the time to come along to our inquiry. And can we just start with the first question then, please? Cara.
Good morning, panel. Just kick off with quite a general question. To what extent would you say that reform is required? There's not been any major lobbying scandals in Holyrood to date, so is there a need to introduce this legislation?
I think whilst there haven't been any scandals, the fact that a scandal only becomes scandalous when one is given access to secret information doesn't mean that there aren't things that might be exposed going on. I think for the Electoral Reform Society, all the research that we've done through focus groups and our Democracy Max inquiry shows us that the general public feel that there is an opaqueness and a secrecy going on behind politics, and they would like more transparency, which would improve their confidence in the process and therefore potentially increase their involvement in the political sphere, which is something that we're very worried about.
Shall we go from right and from left to right? Shall we? That doesn't mean to say that I'm on the right, as it were. But I suppose from the society's point of view, certainly we've detected no particular problem with what lobbying is carried out in the Scottish Parliament or with the Scottish Government. I think, though, echoing what Juliet has said, in terms of maintaining public trust and confidence in the system, the system has to display that it is free from any suggestion that there might be a lack of transparency. And so, therefore, I think we're in a position where we agree that theoretically, whilst there might not be a problem, that doesn't mean to say that additional transparency wouldn't help prevent there from being a problem emerging in the future.
Yeah, not much to add to that. I think sometimes we've seen legislatures react hastily when there is a problem, and there's the old adage that, you know, hard cases make bad law. I think the Parliament has an opportunity here to take preemptive action and make sure that before there are any scandals, it can plug what might be perceived as a gap and take measures to underpin trust and confidence in this bit of the democratic process.
I'm not going to ask the next question because it was going to be about whether it's going to increase confidence in the political process, and the panel have all answered that. So I'll move on. The Code of Conduct for Members of the Scottish Parliament places responsibilities on members in respect to their dealings with lobbyists. And I know that some lobbyist firms have got their own voluntary codes as well. So should the responsibility for registering lie with those being lobbied or the lobbyists, or both?
Obviously, it's important for decision makers to be transparent about who they are meeting with, and I absolutely agree that MSP diaries should be made public. But equally, those who are seeking to influence need to bear in mind their responsibilities to be as transparent as they can be also. And I would certainly say that I think a lobbying transparency register would make MSPs' needs to apply to the Code of Conduct a lot easier, because you would have a basic sort of piece of paper that told you who people were and who they were lobbying on behalf of.
I think we too would suggest that there has to be transparency on both parts. From some experience which I've had recently, I know that in Westminster, ministers are required effectively to make a note of the people they talk to about particular issues. And during the passage of the Transparency of Lobbying Bill in Westminster recently, it became clear that ministers do that, even if it is only one line saying, spoke to Michael Clancy about the banking bill or something like that. From our point of view, we too make a note of the people we talk to and see. I'd like to say that I do it every time, but sometimes I fail in that, and there's a rush at the end of the month to try to make sure that my records are up to date. But certainly it's an important factor in maintaining that transparency. And if you're doing it voluntarily, then there would be no problem about at least saying who you saw or spoke to and what the general topic was. I think that's probably about my contribution on that.
Cameron, did you want to come in on?
Yes, sorry. I just wanted to ask about the diaries. You say the diaries. The problem with the diaries, I feel, is that you can exclude, you just include what you want and exclude stuff. Why do you particularly think the diaries should be published? I'm not very clear on that.
I think that it's about transparency on both sides, and it just means that not only if you're a constituent, you can see who your MSP is meeting with, and then you can go away and see what that company or firm or whatever is doing according to the Lobbying Transparency Register. I would rather have a Lobbying Transparency Register than have MSP's diaries published, but I think having both allows you a sort of a lock-in.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Camilla.
Vic, did you want to come in on the same thing?
It's the same question that Cameron Buchanan went on and to Juliet Swan. In the 2.5 years I've been here, I think I've spoke with about maybe 10 companies, but I've seen about 400 individuals, constituents, or people who are associated with charities, who have been on the Health Committee, maybe want to speak to us about a bill. In regards to, and also my fact in regards to diaries, and it happened when I worked with another company, you can do a diary, but then you have to do a retro diary because during the week things have changed, or we've been called into meetings and we've had to cancel meetings. So would that not involve quite a lot of keeping up to date and involving your staff to keep your diary up to date on a regular basis?
Like I say, I would much prefer for the Lobbying Transparency Register to be the place that you went to look for information. but I'm aware that there are people who are lobbying for MSP, lobbying for MSP's diaries to be made public, and I just want to make it clear that whilst I'm not opposed to that idea, I would want it to be alongside a lobbying transparency register.
So would the diary be for the whole week, Monday to Friday, or 7 days? Because we also do meet people at the weekends.
I think I really don't want to get bogged down in this because I'm not like 100% bothered by it. I'm much more keen to get a lobbying transparency register on the law books. But my sense is that it would be less like on Monday at 2 p.m. I met with JULIET SWANN from the Electoral Reform Society to talk about lobbying than just a list of people that you've met and and what you've talked about. But as I say, it's in order for it to flip back and have the two things working side by side so that people can see what their elected representatives are doing and how their money is being spent.
I'm sorry, if you allow me, Convener, just last question. I'm sorry to keep on pressing you on this. If you want me to be transparent, and the 30-odd years I've been a councillor and an MSP, I've been transparent and very meticulous in what I do. But the situation is that, do you want me to put down everything I do? If you do, I will. If you're saying no, we only want you to publish who you meet if someone's lobbying you, then that's fine. What do you want?
Yes, I see what you're asking, and certainly, yes, the meetings with constituents where you're dealing with constituency issues are a separate issue. This is about lobbying. So when someone is coming to lobby you about an issue, so you could even do it by topic. So, say you're doing the lobbying inquiry, these are all the people that I met. So obviously there's the people you've met in public in the committee, that's open and transparent and everyone can see what we've said. And then you can have and also actually these people came to see me in private. And I don't need to know actually what they said, I just want to know that they came to see you about the Lobbying Transparency Bill. And if they took you for dinner, I'd like to know that too.
Thank you. Michael Clancy, did you want to come in on that?
Thank you, Deputy Convener. I think when one is looking at the code, which was where we started with this discussion, members should consider keeping a record of all contacts with lobbyists, and I think that's a fair statement of an aspiration. To change should to shall is perhaps something which the Parliament itself has to consider whether that is absolutely necessary, given that there's a clear semaphore in the code that this is good practice to do that. So I'm not fussed about diaries. To be honest, my diary is a mess, and it has to be revised sometimes several times a day because of the way in which the day goes. But when one is talking about contacts with lobbyists, then the code makes provision already. And if that is mirrored by those who do the lobbying, then you get something which looks like a rounded picture. I think all of this then, in terms of the diary question and the bulk of meetings which Mr Lyle has adverted to, is something which takes us into the area of who is a lobbyist, what is lobbying, is a constituent lobbying on his or her own behalf when they come to see an MSP. And that really takes us perhaps to a further set of questions.
Thank you.
Richard, did you want to lead on the next question?
Yes, I'm just going on to the next set of questions regarding to lobbying. And let's also remember that on average we get about 100, 200 emails a day lobbying our view on a particular bill or something that's coming up. And I think a point earlier you were saying about cabinet secretaries or ministers meeting with people. Do they not also have to have a member of their staff with them when they're in a meeting?
I think that might be a counsel of perfection.
Yeah, okay. So really, I need to ask the witnesses, what extent would a register address any problems or perceived problems with lobbying?
I would suggest that would depend on the nature of the register. If it was going to be, you get into the area then of, is the register going to be compulsory? Is it going to be voluntary? If it's going to be voluntary, then it's questionable whether it would then address any problem or perceived problem with lobbying.
Anyone else?
I think a good compulsory register would address the problems that we've identified as mistrust and a lack of confidence in the process. Theoretically, if there is no scandal waiting to be exposed, it won't change the way that people's behaviour. Lobbyists will still lobby, and you will still meet with lobbyists. It's just that the public will be able to see who you're meeting with, what you're talking about, and how much they're spending to make that happen.
Briefly.
Come in. Thank you, Convener. Sorry. In answer to Brian Simpson's question, I think we have to assume from this point of view that the thing will be compulsory rather than voluntary, because otherwise we go into all sorts of ways. So if it was compulsory, that I think would be the answer. How would you answer that question?
If it was compulsory, it may well address a problem or perceived problem. But again, if it is compulsory, then you've got to start talking about, well, what sanctions is there going to be? Is there going to be, for example, thresholds for registration? Is there going to be exemptions to that? It all depends on, as I say, what the nature of it actually is going to be. OK, it's going to be compulsory. Is it going to be compulsory for all organisations to actually sign up to it? Because then if you then go into thresholds, you then go into exemptions, you start muddying the waters of transparency a little bit. So I think for it to be truly effective, it would need to be, one, it's going to have to be compulsory. Two, you're going to have to think very, very carefully about thresholds, and if you're going to introduce thresholds. And three, you're going to have to think about exemptions to it.
In your perception, or to the witness's perception, who is a lobbyist? As I said earlier, we have constituents who come in to see us, to maybe talk to us about a particular bill that's coming up in Parliament or whatever. We have emails coming daily. We have, to my mind, a lobbyist is hypothetically drug firm X who wants, because I'm on a particular committee, wants me to press for their drug to be put on the list to be sold, and that's to my mind as a lobbyist. And quite frankly, I'd be very adverse to meet people like that, because at the end of the day they're pushing an individual. If they want to talk to me about the general drug situation in the country, fine. But if they want to speak to me about a particular drug, I'd be averse to meet them. If this was introduced, would MSPs, would you agree with me that MSPs maybe be very careful on who then they would be meeting, rather than if someone emails me and says, I'd like to meet you, I say to my chap, right, OK, set up a date to meet with them. I've not turned anyone away yet, but if it was a case where you thought these people were coming in to lobby you to push a particular drug, you would then say, sorry, I don't want to meet you.
I think before you start looking at a definition of a lobbyist or who is a lobbyist, what you actually have to start with is what is lobbying, because the definition of lobbyist is going to flow naturally from what your definition of lobbying actually is. And we would suggest that lobbying is going to be any kind of contact which is intended directly or indirectly to influence policy or legislation. And if you're being approached in relation to that kind of aim, then whether it's an individual, whether it's an organisation, whether it's a company, business, etc., anybody who approaches you, that would then fall within the definition of lobbyist.
I would agree with that, and I think the panel have evidence submitted in written evidence from Bill Lundberg in Washington, and his definition is very similar to that, and he's worked on lobbying and on the US Register for a number of years. I mean, we all sort of instinctually know what a lobbyist is. You're someone who is paid to influence decision makers. But equally, lobbying isn't a bad thing per se. It's only a bad thing when it is being misused. And I think that's what we're trying to get to grips with. And to come back to your point about whether you would refuse to see people, I think the thing that a lobbying register would allow is that you would be able to automatically connect the people who were asking to see you with their lobbying interests, so you would be able to make an informed decision about whether you saw them or not.
Let's continue then, because I think what you're saying is that we need to be clear on what the definition of a lobbyist is.
Just international comparisons that can be drawn upon, and I know the next panel you have some Raj who's good at that as well.
Yeah. Can I perhaps direct a question at the Law Society then? In your definition of a lobbyist, you state that it should exclude circumstances of which organisations or individuals are directly approached with the objective of seeking views, comment or advice on proposed policy or legislation. Is it possible that this definition has the potential to create a loophole?
I wouldn't say it was a loophole. In situations like that, the organisation approach is not seeking directly to influence. What's been sought from them is simply their advice and guidance. And I know in other jurisdictions where ministers, politicians, government officials approach organisations, that is expressly excluded from the definition of lobbying.
I think it's also important to acknowledge that the process of consultation by government is part of the democratic process and is an essential part in helping government in any jurisdiction to figure out what legislation is necessary, what bright ideas for legislation might be approved or disapproved of by those consultees. And that takes us into the realm of the whole notion of democracy. If government doesn't consult and doesn't consult broadly, then some of the policies which it adopts might not actually have that broad cipher of approval which gives it legitimacy. We respond to around about 100 consultations every year, whether from the Scottish Government or from Whitehall departments or from the European institutions. And these cover everything from agricultural law to wills. I haven't found anything which begins with Z yet, but I will. And zoology, perhaps, if we had something like that. But that gives you an idea of the extent to which our views are sought, sometimes directly, sometimes just because it's been put on a departmental website, and we have an interest in an area, let's say, of intellectual property law or family law or some such area of the law. And instances like this, where institutions like the Society and other bodies are invited to give their views, these are only views. It's up to MSPs as to whether they accept them or not. I mean, they're not in any way meant to influence, because we know that elected representatives have to hold in their hands a balance of interests and to think carefully about what is in the best interests of the people.
And I think also you have to bear in mind that those consultation responses are generally made public. It's not, and what we're getting at here is what information do we not have access to that if we did, it would give the public more confidence in the democratic process. So rather than trying to muddy the waters around something that's already in the public field.
Do you agree that the more exclusions you have, the more the public would see that as being difficulty around, disclosure and,
Yeah, I mean, I think you should start from a point of not excluding any category, but then obviously you also want it to be proportionate. So then you need to work out whether a tiny charity with, 2 or 3 employees who happen to come and visit their MSP once in passing, that's not going to be declarable, but I think at the end of the day, any professional organisation fills out KPIs, they monitor what they're doing, so they should be able to offer that information out to the general public.
And I've got a few members who want to come in here. George, do you want to come in?
It was just on the definition of the lobbyist. It could be quite a difficult one if we go down the whole route of everything being registered. It could become quite a difficult one for a constituency MSP. When does a local business become a lobbyist? When they're in a situation where they're a major employer and as the employed people in your constituency and as the local MSP, you want to represent these people, when does that become, say they've got a paid comms person who keeps you up to date with everything that's happening, when does that actually become, you know, how do we get the definition correct so that we end up with a situation, because you've got a crossover there?
Sorry. If they're seeking to influence legislation or policy change or seeking to secure a contract, then that would be lobbying.
I can understand that. That's very simplistic.
Yeah.
What I'm talking about is the ideal that this employer needs something to happen locally to make sure that it can progress their business and help your constituents at the same time. You know, and so you're talking about the employment, the people actually working in your constituency in this major employer, and they're trying to influence. When does that become? When do they become actually a lobbyist at that stage, and you're crossing over? I'm not just talking about just the basics, you know, they're going to change the law, the legislation or anything like that. I'm talking about how do we get the definition to such a state that when does that cross over into them actually? Because in our day-to-day life, as Richard's already said, there's people trying to influence us and try and get their point across, right from an individual coming to you about a planning situation to something in a licensing situation. You know, it could be anything. So how do we get this definition correct so it doesn't become cumbersome, it doesn't become bureaucratic, and we get a situation where it can actually be, the public can believe that it actually does deliver what they're wanting, there's transparency?
I guess I would say two things. One is, again, to refer to international examples, and certainly I'm aware that Austria recently introduced lobbying registration, and it's an ongoing process. They're realising that there were certain exemptions they made that aren't working, so they're bringing those people into the fold. Also, obviously you're right. You don't want to overly bureaucratise and penalise people who are genuinely working for the public interest. I would flip it around a wee bit and say, for instance, if I'm a local group of people who are opposed to a wind farm development in your constituency, I come to see you about that. That's fine. That's not lobbying. I'm seeking to influence you, yes, but because my interest in the local area and because of my personal interest. What I would be interested in doing, though, if I was in that small campaigning organisation, is finding out who was meeting with government officials from the wind farm company that were wanting to build it in your constituency, and that's what the lobbying register would do.
Thank you. Now, could we just keep our questions brief, please?
Mr Glancy, Miss Swan, are you lobbyists? Yeah. Would you class yourself as lobbyists?
Not all the time, but right now I'm lobbying for lobbying, yes.
I suppose some people would describe me as a lobbyist.
That's answered my question. Thank you.
Cameron, did you want to come in on the same?
Just quickly, yes. In Westminster, they have got a register where only people who lobbying register. You've got to be registered for VAT before you come in as a lobbyist. The very small people don't get registered, which is what you hinted on. What's your opinion on that?
The Lobbying Act at Westminster isn't a lobbying act. It covers a very, very small number of people and doesn't cover any in-house lobbyists, whether they be from charities or commercial organisations. It is not a model to follow. I hope it gets repealed.
I think we would actually agree with that as well. We've been monitoring and following all of the developments on the Lobbying Act down at Westminster, and we've made a few suggestions and suggested amendments. We ourselves don't agree that it really addresses the perceived problem actually down at Westminster, and that there's too many exemptions to it.
Also, interestingly, Part 2 actually, which is the part that registers non-party campaigners, so people like myself, I can still meet with you guys and do that in secret if I want to. I just can't tell the public about it. It's a complete sham of a legislation.
Stuart, did you want to come in briefly?
It might be appropriate to apologise for my late arrival. Entirely my fault. I forgot to update the meeting time in my diary. Ironically, I was sitting at my desk going through the last 3 months of my diary, seeking to try and identify what was lobbying and coming up with a list of 17 answers to that question. But I actually found it very difficult to do, which I found, but to try and do it was very illuminating. But I just wanted to very briefly ask, do the panel members think the most important thing is to catch activity or to catch organisations and people?
Activity.
I think we would agree with that. Activity.
Okay, thank you for your brief answers. Thank you. And how do proposals for a register sit alongside Parliament's founding principles of accessibility, openness, accountability and the sharing of power? David Robb, would you like to answer that?
Yes, thank you. I think they sit well in one sense. So the general spirit behind the inquiry here to improve transparency and to make visible things that are perhaps less visible at the moment than they ought to be, and to dispel public mistrust arising out of that. That has to be a good thing. There is a danger, and we've been skirting around the edges of that in the discussion here, that if the system becomes too bureaucratic, if the definitions are too wide, if very small-scale activity starts to become need to be declared, then there could be a deterrent effect. So there could be, if the regime is seen to be too difficult and challenging for occasional small-scale non-professional lobbyists, and in the sector I work, a lot of charitable activity would fall into that category. So there is a danger that it could act as a deterrent and make Parliament perversely less accessible. And that, I think, is the challenge here, is striking the right balance.
I think, yeah, obviously it has to be proportionate. And I mean, the aim is to enhance democracy and to build on the reputation the Parliament has for transparency and openness. I do think, with the situation in Westminster being as bad as it is, and the fact that we're having a proper lobbying inquiry up here is incredibly welcome. And I think does enhance the reputation of this Parliament. And if they went forward and produced a decent, comprehensive, proportionate register, then I think that would enhance the reputation still further.
I suppose it depends on the definition of the activities which are going to be regulated. But for the activities of the Parliament which most clearly attain those objectives from the consultative steering group about openness and accessibility, for example, the Public Petitions Committee, that would probably not really be impacted very adversely by having a register of lobbyists. Similarly, you would still get 400 members of the public contacting you over a period of time from your constituency or from other constituencies because of proposals which are brought forward. And I think we all know that in certain circumstances MSP inboxes get filled to overflowing because of certain proposals going through the Parliament, but some other proposals attract very little, if any, attention from members of the public, and it's only anoraks like Brian or me, indeed, who might be at all interested in some small regulatory change to water quality regulations or something like that. Probably the water industry will come down hard on me about that. But you know, it's in that area that you can trust the public in one sense to use the openness and accessibility of the Parliament where there are issues which the Parliament is considering affect the public most.
Move on to the next set of questions then. Cameron.
Quite a few of them have been answered, but what I wanted to ask was, if there is a register, what information would you include in it, ignoring the diary factor for the moment, because we've covered that? The basic just guts of the meeting, or
I would want to know who is doing the lobbying. I'd also be interested in their employment history because of the revolving door principle. I want to know who they are lobbying, so who is lobbying whom. I want to know on whose behalf they're doing the lobbying, about what, and how much they're spending.
And anybody else?
We would agree with most of those. The only one that we're not adverse to, but don't quite understand it, because I don't think a case is being made out for it. But why disclose the financial amount that's actually being disclosed on lobbying? We don't see that that serves any real purpose, and a lot of that is actually business-sensitive information. In addition, from the Law Society's perspective, and for solicitors who may advise clients on parliamentary procedure and parliamentary interactions, it may cause also a problem to disclose the details of the clients as well, because solicitors owe a duty of confidentiality to clients, so that might cause a little bit of a problem as well.
Chris, do you think there should be a fee for registering? Do you have a fee?
Well,
registering the lobbyists?
Obviously, we need to have some way of financially supporting the register, but equally, you don't want to exclude people who can't afford to pay or don't want to pay or don't understand that they have to pay, and B, just, yes, it starts getting a little bit complicated. I would look at international examples and see how it works elsewhere.
I would say if there was going to be a fee introduced, then it should be proportionate to the size of the organisation.
Yeah, so that's fine, thank you.
Well, who would administer the register? Have you got views on that?
Who would you have administering the register? Independent?
Inquiry needs to think about. It doesn't need to be independent, of course, independent of government. I think actually the Oscar model is probably one that I would identify as being a useful, independent regulatory body that works.
Did you want to come in?
Yes, if you don't mind, convener. Again, sorry, Juliet, SWANN, I keep coming back to you. I do apologise, but you said basic. Yeah. Okay. Drug company A, Mr. A and other wants to meet with me, so I have to request from him all that you have just said previously. Why you want to meet me? Sorry?
He will already have submitted
They'd
that.
already registered
that.
So I only need to put down, I met Mr. A and other from drug company B, and we discussed the health bill.
Farmers, yes, exactly.
That's fine, thanks.
And who would monitor the register, and what sanctions would there be?
Well, let's go back to the previous question about should the register be independent. Of course, the register should be independent. Should be independent of Parliament. It should be independent of government, and so that takes us into commissioner territory. If one looks at the very good note which Spice provided, it talks, I think, of the Canadian Commissioner for Lobbying. That looks like that might be a good fit. Just depends. We would have to think carefully about it when and if any bill is produced. But clearly, if there were to be an independent commissioner for lobbying, then that would be the body that would be charged with monitoring, and there could be a sanctions regime in that. I mean, I think in our memorandum of comments we talk about the voluntary system which exists at the European institutions. The sanctions there are pretty, well, don't have a great deal of punch, I think is the best way of describing them. But you could think in terms of deregistration, because if we're thinking about a compulsory register, then deregistration would clearly be the principal sanction that one would exercise. There might also be a system of fines. It might be a criminal offence to be a lobbyist without being on the register, which would import criminal sanctions for breach of that. So I think these are all the kinds of things that one would want to examine closely when constructing a register which was going to be completely effective.
Yeah,
just very briefly to reinforce those points, I haven't seen. I've been looking at the evidence that's come to the committee so far. I haven't seen much discussion about costs and resourcing implications. Most of the discussion has been about principle, but I would urge the committee to consider the practicalities. I think if public confidence is going to be underpinned, and the Canadian model, I would like a bit more time to look at that. But it does suggest an independent body with sufficient resource and clout to police the regime. So we shouldn't delude ourselves that this gain that we want to see in lobbying won't have to be invested in significantly, because a toothless regime that's under-resourced wouldn't do anything to underpin public confidence.
So you think an existing body could do it, like so the Standards Commission?
I think this seems closest to what the Standards Commission does, but it couldn't do that without a substantial addition to its resources.
Certainly, I would agree on the resources question that, if this is about our democracy, if we value our democracy, then we will invest in it to make sure that it is transparent and people have confidence in it.
For that, how will the requirements of a register fit with the existing requirements for charities law? And will there be an overlap between the lobbying register of the OSCR, for example, and what discussions have been made between OSCR and third sector organisations about the implications of a lobbying register?
Well, as the committee has heard, and we've mentioned this morning, the passage of the legislation in Westminster towards the tail end of last year excited a great deal of activity throughout the voluntary and charity sectors. So we were engaged in quite a lot of discussion with interests on both sides of the border in connection with that legislation. It's been said already that legislation has quite a different focus to, I think, what we're discussing here. But it did raise the general issues about the legitimacy of campaigning activity from charities, and it's been heartening to see a recognition, certainly in the Scottish debate, that that's a perfectly valid activity that nobody wants to see suppressed. In our written evidence to you, we've flagged up that the 2005 Act that is the main instrument setting out what's appropriate for charities. There is a restriction on political activity, and that usually comes into play close to campaigns. So it's not appropriate for charities to campaign for the interests of a political party. But campaigning on issues is, of course, the lifeblood of charities. Where campaigning strays into lobbying, that's the definitional territory that was touched on earlier, and I think that is tricky. But at the moment, the Act does have a backstop prohibiting charities from overtly political activity. That works quite well. I don't therefore see much tension between that and the introduction of a new lobbying regime. We would want to work closely with the body charged with administering and policing that regime, because we would see this as an issue that affects public confidence, and we'd want to work closely with those bodies.
I think at the end of the day, most charities and campaigning organisations publicise their successes in order to enhance their supporter base. And I think what we're talking about with a register of lobbying activity is that it would actually make a level playing field between NGOs and corporations, and indeed between small local campaigning groups and corporations. So it's not, we have to remember that it's not just about charitable campaigning, it's about the other sorts of lobbying that go on that charities are fighting against often, and that they need to have that transparency in order to inform their campaigning activity.
Richard, do you want to come in?
Yes, if I could ask you all, there is one main thing that this Parliament is good at, is that individuals or particularly organisations can contact individual MSPs and ask them to submit amendments to bills that are coming in front. And I have had meetings with two organisations in the last couple of weeks who wished amendments, and me to support particular their views on amendments that were coming forward. What is your view in regards to that? Would that lessen the amount of people who would come in to ask individual MSPs to put forward amendments, because they would be possibly have to be declared, because that's pushing policy, that's basically trying to change policy. So would that then stop individual organisations or even MSPs from putting forward amendments because they're then seen to be supporting a particular issue?
It wouldn't stop you from doing it. It would just mean that everyone could see that you were doing it.
Okay.
But if you make the regime of declaration and registration and documenting particularly onerous, it could have a deterrent effect.
Submitting of amendments or suggested amendments is obviously an activity directly or indirectly intended to influence changes in legislation. And if we would suggest if an organisation or a person is going to that extent to submit these to MSPs for consideration, and they're trying to influence the MSPs to put those forward, then that is going to fall within the ambit of lobbying, and therefore, in our views, they should be required to register.
Not then, with greatest respect, Convener, would that then basically come to a situation that people may not put forward amendments where they should put forward amendments because of the fact that they're then seen to be tied to a particular cause, concern, organisation?
I think if somebody feels so strongly that they're going to be putting forward amendments, then I don't think they would have a particular problem with understanding that it would be necessary for them to register.
Did you want to
Could I just do a wee follow-up to that? I mean, I think if you're thinking that MSPs would have if it would have a cooling effect on MSPs putting forward amendments, generally speaking, the kind of amendments which the Law Society put forward to MSPs are those which, in our view, are designed to clarify or improve legislation. And I think it's the question of the objective of the amendment. And as we know from the many instances where at stage 2 in a bill or at stage 3 in a bill, there are several hundred amendments perhaps, some of them from government, many of them from government, many from other organisations and from individuals. Frequently the amendments get debated, but there is no guarantee that an amendment will be accepted. And to raise an issue in debate is something which I think is part of the purpose of having a parliament. You know, you want to get a debate on an issue. Just because one signs off an amendment in one's name to be debated, I don't think that necessarily means that the elected representative has signed up to the whole agenda of the people promoting the amendment. And the MSP may just be wanting a debate on an issue which, to that MSP, seems meritorious to have a debate about.
I think it's sort of dealing with specific examples maybe isn't terribly helpful, because it is about a sort of broader consideration of when. So, for instance, I used to work for RSPB Scotland. I was a lobbyist for RSPB Scotland. That's what I did. It was my job, and I influenced the climate change legislation. But we would have declared that we were lobbying on climate change and speaking to ex-MSPs and because that's what the register would require, and it would say that we'd spent X amount of money doing that. It wouldn't necessarily say, I lodged this specific amendment that improved heathland burning, but muir burning. But it would just say I sought to influence the Climate Change Act in the interests of the RSPB.
Just very briefly, it's not an area in which we have great expertise to offer, but it seems to me from listening to the debate that it would be possible to construct a register that's sophisticated enough to deal with different categories of activity. You're absolutely right. A lot of people will contact MSPs and other interests around the passage of legislation that is seeking to influence policy and therefore should be caught. But there might be a simple quick way of registering that kind of activity that is different from the more kind of long-term, commercially driven lobbying activity that is the real purpose here. So you might have a tiered system, but I would say you have to make it simple to use and there might be ways of doing that.
At the end of the day, sorry, can I very quickly just say, because isn't there already a sort of a requirement that if an individual contacts you, they should be your constituent, unless they are lobbying? Because usually you get, I need to know your postcode so that I know that you're my constituent. Is it? It's not.
It's more so.
Well, I would suggest that there is maybe something in that to do with the difference between a constituent coming to talk to you, or even a constituent sending you information about a piece of legislation, than there is about someone who is neither of those things.
But we do try to ensure, if there are occasions that I email people back and say, can you send me your address or whatever, but, right across the broad spectrum, you get hundreds of emails, and it's on a particular issue, and we don't, with the greatest respect, have the time. I'm in here for 8:30 in the morning to maybe 9 o'clock at night, but I don't have the time to look at all my emails. I have staff who do that.
Yeah. I think, because if we're thinking about, for instance, the activity that went on around the Equal Marriage Bill, where there were lots of emails coming from different organisations, but through constituents. So I think, but that whilst the Equality Network would be declaring themselves as a lobbyist, all the individual constituents who happened to share their views or share the views of the Scotland for Marriage Coalition wouldn't have to declare their interests.
Do you want to come in on that?
I wanted to come in on it because when we had things like the Equal Marriage Act, and now we've got dogs and things, every MSP is lobbied. We have no, as Richard says, we have no idea where it's coming from. We have to reply to them, but they're lobbying they're contacting every single MSP, all MSPs. So I'm not sure about it. My question really was, how would you monitor compliance for this? And also, if it wasn't correct, would you introduce some sort of sanction, financial or otherwise? I strike them off the register or whatever. That's really my question.
Answers brief, please.
Michael already touched on that, talking about sort of compliance, and I again would just say, I think looking at international examples, there are very good examples out there. Canada is one. Oddly, America is actually quite a good system, albeit there's a lot of money running around. People know how much money there is running around. And the first part of your question, I forget. Sorry.
The first part of the question was it was connected to both the monitoring and the sanctions, realistically. So it's whether we
yes, the monitor. Again,
monitor.
Yeah, just I do think international examples are the best
to all
way
MSPs,
forward.
We keep getting. It wasn't really a question. I was just answering your question, saying, we get masses of emails, but that's not the point.
But obviously,
how do you monitor?
As I say, you identify the organisation that's lobbying, not the constituent. I think just because it's not easy doesn't mean it's not possible. I went back, actually, I was looking at the debates around the Charity and Trustee Investment Act, because I think there's some similarities here with what that legislation sought to do in improving transparency and confidence in the charitable sector. And there was a lot of chat about how this is really difficult, this is quite complicated, how will it work? And I think just because it's difficult and complicated doesn't mean we shouldn't do it.
Come in.
I just wanted to pick a small point about amendments that have been provided by the Law Society and many others. It's been the practice in the past that many MSPs bringing forward such amendments will say that that is where the amendment has come from. And I'd just like to get the sense of the panel as to whether you think it should be mandated by the MSP's Code of Conduct that when an amendment has come from an external body, that statement be made at the time that the amendment is dealt with.
I'd like to think that people can recognise the excellence of our amendments without actually being identified, but you're absolutely right. That would be a great assistance to transparency, convener, if MSPs said, as a matter of course, this amendment originates from the Cambuslang Renewal Trust or whatever, or the Law Society. But that's quite a clear and easy, low-hanging issue.
Richard, did you want to ask the question on thresholds?
Basically, I think most of it has been answered, but I'll round it. Should there be a threshold for registration? We've talked about individuals, constituents, lobbyists. To me, a lobbyist is a drug company come to me to say, I want you to push our drug in the Health Committee, which I would say no, In fact, I tried it actually after had stopped the meeting and say bye. But aye. Should there be a threshold, and what exemptions, in all honesty, what exemptions should be off the register?
I think we need to remember we're talking about paid lobbyists. We're not talking about like volunteers or constituents. And your example is entirely accurate. So that would be a paid lobbyist. As I touched on before, I think I'm in favour of sort of two at this exploratory stage: A, looking at international examples, and B, including everyone, and then working out what the exemptions and thresholds should be. I do think there should probably be some exemptions and thresholds, but where they sit, and as I say, as Austria has learnt, you do sort of have to be quite flexible about that and come back and make changes as you learn how the system is working.
In relation to thresholds, we suggest that if you introduce thresholds, then you start introducing potential loopholes for companies to circumvent or businesses circumvent. If you're talking about thresholds and who's going to monitor the thresholds, will it be the responsibility of the potential lobbyists to actually monitor themselves to see when those thresholds are actually met? And who's going to ensure, who's going to check that they are correctly and adequately actually monitoring those thresholds? That's what we would say in relation to thresholds. And again, when you come through to exemptions, if you start talking exemptions, then you start talking about the public's perception of transparency. Because if you're exempting one organisation, but you're requiring another organisation to be registered, the public are not necessarily going to understand why one's got to be registered, one hasn't got to be registered. They may not understand the difference between these two organisations. So I think it might be a little bit problematic that way.
This is it. I mean, I think, as I say, looking at keeping everyone in to start with, and then, because it's new, let's take a flexible approach, but I would say I would favour no exemptions and no thresholds.
I agree with that.
All or nothing.
Aye.
Sorry, did you want to come in, David?
I find this one difficult. My day job is to police and maintain a comprehensive register of Scotland's charities, and in that respect I think we have an advantage over other parts of the UK where the register is not comprehensive. But as soon as you bring that comprehensive reach, the questions of proportionality bite very hard. So striking that balance between what is reasonable to expect of very small scale, non-professional, occasional people engaging in lobbying activity, and that's very, very difficult. So I think a lot of this, the devil will be in the detail, and I think it's difficult to generalise around this. What my fellow panellists have said has to be right. The maximum public confidence will derive from the widest reach, but that might be the hardest regime to operate in practice.
It may be that the level of reporting is where we achieve proportionality, that some people only declare annually, other people declare quarterly.
I think we've exhausted all our questions. Unless you have any particular points that the panel would like to put to us before we finish this session, we can. I'll just thank you all for your attendance and for coming along today. Thank you.
Suspension as well.
And we'll suspend the meeting temporarily. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll resume the business of the meeting, and once again my apologies for my administrative failure to be here on time. It's my pleasure to welcome our second panel of the day, Robin McAlpin, the Director of the Jimmy Reid Foundation, Professor Raj Chari, who's the Department of Political Science at Trinity College Dublin, and someone who's familiar, perhaps one might even say over-familiar with some of us, Professor Susan Deakin, now translated from her humble origins to Assistant Principal Corporate Engagement, University of Edinburgh, but who is stressing that she's appearing in a personal capacity today rather than representing the institution which I've just named. Let's move straight to questions, if we may, and just say to the panel, as I've said to previous panels, at the very end I'll invite you to make comments if you think there's matters we've not otherwise covered. I think that seems to work as an approach. Got to hear from Karen.
Good morning, panel. Just to kick things off, to what extent would you say reform is required? Obviously, there's not really been any major lobbying scandals at Holyrood to date, so is there really a need to introduce legislation?
Yes, absolutely. There's no question about it. The influence of lobbyists in all the work of the Scottish Parliament, the Scottish Government, is very substantial, very significant indeed. It's a profession that spends an awful lot of money seeking to get democratic outcomes moved in a direction that they want that to move in. Now, I think that's fine. I think that's an important part of democracy. But it's absolutely essential that people can understand and see the scale of it. So the fact that there's not been a specific scandal, I don't think is either here and there. I think of it in terms of, for example, any form of data collection which is there to identify the scope of something important that's happening in society. So, for example, you don't need to have specific scandals of, say, racial bias in hiring to say that it's good to keep the data on the minority issues in hiring so that you know if there is a problem. And right now, we know very little about what's going on, the scale of it, the scope of it. So it's hard to say whether there has been a scandal. And if you look at key pieces of legislation that are going through the Scottish Parliament just now, they have been the whole debate and the whole structure of it have been so heavily influenced by the lobbying industry, thinking of minimum pricing of alcohol or plain packaging for cigarettes. These are very substantial interventions that are being made, and yet we know very little about the volume, the scale of what that intervention involves. So yes, it's not about waiting until something very, very bad happens. It's saying that there should be transparency in democracy, and it's absolutely essential that people can understand just how much money and effort goes in to making you make decisions that certain vested interests want you to make.
I can try to answer that, but not from an understanding of the political system fully of Scotland. I'm Canadian myself, so my understanding of lobbying regulation goes from a more international comparative perspective. Notwithstanding, even if there is no scandal in your political system, it's still important to have lobbying regulation precisely because of what was said earlier in order to promote transparency and accountability in your political system. Now, that said, many political systems historically, such as Canada and the United States, they have implemented lobbying laws as a consequence of scandal, but it's not necessarily the case that all countries have done that. The view is that you have lobbying legislation in order to promote transparency. You have other laws that prevent corruption as well. Those should be seen as a sort of additional side, but lobbying registration is there for transparency and to see who's talking to whom and about what.
I think it would be quite the wrong thing to do to legislate in this area. I think there are an awful lot of practices, codes, rules, procedures and statute that are germane to this discussion that have rightly been considered and put in place over the, 15 years now that the institution's been in place, and indeed even some of the work that took place before that through the CSG and so on. If I were sitting in this committee now, what I would be wanting to do is to dust down an awful lot of these codes and existing regulation and statute and think about ways of how you constantly ensure that it's embedded in the thinking and the practice of the institution as a whole and of individual members. I'm very, very passionate, albeit that I'm on the outside looking in rather than the inside looking out now. I'm as passionate as ever I was about ensuring that Holyrood is a place that is seen to be open and accessible and transparent, and that and the politics of Scotland and politicians of Scotland, you know, are seen to be trusted, or we work to build trust and confidence and respect. But I think there are other, far better ways to do it. I'm happy to elaborate beyond that at some point if you want, but that's my shortish answer.
Susan's response sort of leads into my next question, which is, there's a lot of cynicism out there about politics and politicians. Do you not think that the greater openness that we would get from a lobbying bill would increase people's confidence in the political process?
No, I don't. I think that that's a mistake that's often been made in the Scottish Parliament. And I remember discussing this, well, continue to discuss this with people across the political spectrum, that I think it's all too easy to say that just because we can legislate in Scotland, we should legislate in Scotland, that just because you have the capability to put something in the statute book, that therefore it should be done. It's often not the right way forward. And I think there are many, many examples of where, you know, a legislative route has been chosen, and then, you know, MSPs subsequently start to, well, maybe not regret that they've embarked on that journey, but seen a lot of the problems and pitfalls. I mean, that last discussion, for example, you know, the questions that were being posed about the detail. You know, the legislative process by its nature is about precision and detail and definition. And I think before ever you start putting anything in statute, but you have to be sure that you can actually give it that precision. And I think you're in terrain here that you just can't. And if I can just add a couple of comments about where I'm coming from in all of this, and also want to be totally transparent myself. I mean, since I left the Parliament, and I have and I continue to spend part of my life working in the academic community, so I still look at the public policy process through another lens, if you like, but I've also sat in a multiplicity of boards in the private sector and in, you know, advisory roles in the public sector and a number of charities. So I see this from all different dimensions, and my passion and interest still, and my plea to you, is to find ways to have more ways of all these different worlds interconnecting and sharing mutual understanding. And I came in when George Adam was asking the question about, you know, when does a local business become a lobbyist, and, you know, when are they an employer, or, you know, are they in a business that needs to be understood for other reasons? And I think that's at the nub of things. I don't think we can keep putting people or organisation in boxes, and I certainly don't think we can say what the intent of their action is. I mean, a court of law struggles to, you know, identify the issue of intent. I think what we can and should do is create multiple opportunities for views and opinions to be shared, and have trust and confidence in our elected politicians that they have the good sense to then judge what view they will take, and they'll be held to account for it.
Can I pick up on the trust issue? We held a commission. We asked a lot of people that, from the kind of organisations who don't have lobbyists, who don't have a lot of power, might be community groups, smaller charities, that sort of thing, what their experience in general of getting access to influence is. And what they come back, the most common thing that comes back is the sense of a kind of black box effect. They can see the inputs, they can see where it starts, and they can see the outputs, they can see what happens, but they can't link them. There's a black box in between the two. And let me pick again, because I think it's a very pertinent one, something like minimum pricing for alcohol. So you're looking and you're saying, right, OK, so all the health experts and the police and the public sector medicals and most of academia, this evidence is quite solid. So we see there's the starting point for minimum price for alcohol. And then there's a long drawn-out debate, and it may not result in anything. Now, that bit in the middle is the bit that democracy has a problem with, the bit where people can't quite understand what are the things that influence. Now, there is a chance that if you start to shine a light on that, and you see, well, what actually happened in here is that corporate lobbyists flew in a hell of a lot of people with a hell of a lot of expensive research, the purpose of which to try and, how shall I say, undermine the other research which was there at the beginning, and that's a long process with a lot of engagement, a lot of money spent. I was a political lobbyist. This is what I did. I was a political lobbyist for 12 years. And then at the outcome of it, people can't quite understand what's going on. Now, if you shine a light on that, it doesn't necessarily mean everyone's going to say, oh, we've got a brilliant political system, I'm absolutely delighted. It might actually generate some cynicism. But that's part of the point. If people do not feel confident that the reason that these decisions are being made in the way they're being made, if they can at least understand why, then we can have a debate and a discussion about whether that worked. Was that the right way to do it? The problem just now is when the lights aren't on, as soon as you get an input, it goes in, there's a big political process, and then it pops out the other side, and people are like, well, wait a minute, that didn't look like that when it went in. That's the thing that people feel cynical about. They don't understand the processes through which decisions are made, because far too much of it is deliberately kept away from the public eye.
Could I just say to all the panel, let's just keep it quite tight. I'm going to let Cara run with this to the end of her questions, and I'll bring other members in with supplementaries, even if it's, because I think...
Okay, Min, did you have a response on that last?
Look, I can't make any qualitative or quantitative judgment for that matter whether Scottish people will feel closer to a political system with the lobbying register. His international experience is that generally people do, because generally they are online systems that allow people as consumers to see who's talking to who on which issues. So what we have seen in our own interviews with interest groups in particular is that they're big users of registers as well. It helps them understand different lobbying strategies. It creates a transparency in the system where politicians can openly say, look, you want to know with whom I've talked? It's all on the register. And that's how it will increase people's confidence in the political system. Does it need to be reflected on? I think those are Susan's points, and I think that's actually quite essential whenever you're trying to develop a lobbying register. That said, there are many international examples that Scotland can take from. Particularly Canada, we can talk about the details of some of the legislation there, or how they define lobbyist and what is an attempt to influence. But you don't need to reinvent the wheel here. It's not like you're starting from ground zero. So if there's a political will from your committee, and if the government decides to do it, to pursue this, there certainly is a good bunch of evidence you can take from to draft a lobbying bill without a problem. Yeah.
The Code of Conduct for members of the Scottish Parliament places responsibilities on members in respect to their dealings with lobbyists. Some consultant lobbyist firms also have got their own voluntary codes. So should the responsibility for registering lie with those being lobbied, or the lobbyists, or both?
Lie with the lobbyists. The difficulty with the difficulty with making it reporting on the part of the people lobbied is that it's a very, very broad community. I see again, I was a political lobbyist for 12 or 13 years. I was head of public affairs for the University of Scotland, which lobbied on behalf of the universities. And the bulk of our work really wasn't with you. Most of our lobbying work, we would work directly with civil servants or with agency people. We would work with government and advisors. Now, if you're self-reporting and they're all self-reporting and other people are self-reporting in different places, it's very difficult to get an overall picture. So what you have to say is, who is any one campaign, anyone in campaign to try and change legislation or change opinions, what is that one campaign talking to? Are they talking to a lot of quangos as well and the civil service? Is that same campaign hiring a lot of academic work to get... It's to be able to get a coherent picture, not just of a generic what is being done in the Scottish Parliament, how much lobbying is there, but if you are, say, on the wrong side of one of these decisions, you can at least look and say, well, what I faced here was £3 million worth of academic research, 4 lobbyists who were working in this. You can see a specific case by case what was happening. And so it's important that it's not just a kind of background hum, but you can actually dig down and say that was the lobbying that was done on behalf of.
Your question? Oh, sorry. I think your question is who should the object of regulation be, right? And it's most legislation in the world has the object of regulation as the lobbyist, not the person that is lobbied. Now that said, in Canada, I think it's encouraged that MPs or ministers of government will record with whom they've talked, but it's not absolutely essential that they do that. And the only reason they would is if there is a spot check by the independent regulator to see if that lobbyist actually had made contact with a public official. So the object of regulation here is the lobbyist. It is not the parliamentarian or the minister.
I think by far and away the primary responsibility is on the elected member to be able not just to explain to the public, but frankly to be able to look themselves in the mirror and know the basis upon which they've reached a view and be aware that their views have been shaped, influenced and formed by a multiplicity of different sources and information. I hope that every elected member will go out their way as much as time permits to seek out as many sources as possible in reaching that view, and then feel able to, as I said earlier, be held to account. I want to pick up on something. I'm living a bit dangerously here. I may regret when I leave the room that I've opened this one up. But, you know, Robin talked about a black box there. And I'm quite happy to buy into the metaphor. I fundamentally disagree and don't recognise what he described as being what's in the black box. Of course, there are issues that lots of people don't understand about how there's been all sorts of public and open and transparent process around a bill or an issue, and then somehow something else comes out the other end. But what's really in the black box? I mean, take something like minimum pricing, and I will say this because I spoke out about it at the time, right? A whole lot of party political issues came into play there. That's more often than not in the black box. Electoral imperatives are in the black box. Fear is in the black box because people worry, you know, whether they're individuals or organisations, they worry about how their views are going to be portrayed in the media if they speak out publicly. They're worried about falling out with the government of the day. There's all sorts of quiet phone calls take place. Different governments, I may say, of different hues, you know, that, oh, you know, that's not very helpful if you say this, if you say that. People are worried about their futures and public appointments. All these things come into play. That's the stuff that's in the black box.
And a lot of expensive lobbyists. That's all true. Well, but there's a lot of expensive lobbyists in the black box as well.
Well, all I say is I don't recognise the world as you've described it, Robin, and I've seen it, as I say, from both sides. That's, we'll just agree to disagree.
Can I just say, please, address remarks?
I beg your pardon.
Mr McAlpin. Sorry. I'm speaking to very specifically, address the remarks to Gavina. He may be imperfect, but he's doing his best. Richard, I think you had a question, I hope, Richard.
Yes, it is a question, but if I may, I don't see the point that Mr McAlpin's making. I was in the Health Committee with
question,
there is a question. The alcohol and the plain packaging. I never saw any individual companies. What we did do is we listened to witnesses like yourself, and then we came to a decision. Would that then stop witnesses coming to committees to give their opinions if we had to worry about a black box?
No, the point is not. People seem to think that lobbying is all about face-to-face contact. That's not the big part of public affairs. The big part of public affairs is about how you frame the debate. So I can see exactly how, well, not precisely, I can see the money that's been spent on minimum pricing for alcohol. They bring people in, they pull evidence in, they create evidence. I'm not saying they manufacture, I'm saying they get academics to look at certain things, to create certain ideas and thoughts and opinions. They don't have to be there all the time. I was, like I said again, I lobbied for the university for 13 years. If we wanted to make a case, we would influence the politicians in the party, not by coming and just nagging you, sitting down with you for very long periods of time and eventually wearing you down. What we would do is spend a lot of money and a lot of time putting together very strong evidence. Now, I can tell you again, if I was coming in here against to give evidence against a small community group which was doing something else, I would be horrified as a professional lobbyist if I couldn't beat them. I've got twice the resources they have. Any access to any research they can have, I can have somebody have twice as much research that counteracts their research. They don't have the research capacity, they don't have the preparation capacity, they haven't got the money that they can put into being able to commission research and all these kind of things. Now, that all happens before anybody's talking to you. This is all in the background. This is about framing the debate before there's a lobbyist talking to you at any point. And that whole campaign is very expensive. The cost of the 1 hour meeting with you and the time with the 1 hour meeting at you at the end of it is not expensive. That bit is about passing on the message. It's about being able to say, how much did you spend on the campaign? Not, did you see 5 politicians or 7?
Sorry, Convener, I have to just let me back slightly.
Richard, I'm going to bring you back. I just want to make a general point. In the evidence that the committee is getting, it would be very helpful if witnesses are able to focus. Help us understand what actions we might take. I think the analysis of the problem we do want to hear, but can I just encourage you to shift the balance a bit from analysing the problem, which we're listening to with interest, to perhaps helping us understand some of the actions we might take. Richard.
It would be remiss of me. I'm sorry, Mr McAlpin. You must have a very low opinion of MSPs who have their own opinion, and in the 30 years I've been a politician, nobody has changed my mind if I think. I do apologise, Convener, I have to say it, and defend MSPs. So, to what extent would a register address any problems or perceived problems with lobbying?
See the transparency. I say again, it's about having the data to be able to see the picture that's there. I just want to say that if lobbying didn't work, people wouldn't spend so much money on it. Lobbying does work. I mean, there's no question that lobbying works. It's one of the world's biggest industries. It does work. The key is simply to say, let people have the data. Let people say, this was what we spent on this campaign. To have the data in public, to be able to record it, just that. So the thing is about the capacity for the public to say, these are the forces which came to play in this decision-making process. Of course, I don't think people are stupid. I'm not for a second saying that politicians don't make generally good decisions. They do. But they are influenced continually through the process, and sometimes that influence does make decisions come out in a way that you might not have expected at the start of the process. Being able to understand how that happened is important. It's not to decry anyone. Lobbying is important. I'm not criticising lobbying. It's an important part of democracy. And I'm not criticising politicians for listening to lobbying. That's very important too. I'm just saying everybody else should have some idea of the picture, some capacity to see what it looks like.
I wonder if I could ask Professor Raj, whom I know is running to a tight timetable, and I'm anxious to make sure we get as much as we can from your presence here today. I'm going to come to George Adams shortly, but I wonder if you'd care to respond to the little debate that's going on to your right and perhaps lead us a little bit towards some of the things we here might do.
Well, I'm going to tell you what I think is going to be helpful for the committee if you're thinking about developing a law. Okay, there's a whole issue of Political Science 101 of what goes on in the black box. Not to be critical, but to say that I think that, as you rightly said, that's maybe a different issue. So I think you need to take care of a couple of things. How do you define lobbying? Okay, so lobbying, I think, is one of the most contested definitions of any concept in political science. You rarely get two scholars that are going to agree with what is meant by it or what's meant by the term lobby group. Now, generally, I think an accepted definition would be to the effect of a lobby group is an individual or an organization which would have shared or vested interests, specific interests, that tries to seek to influence political decisions. Now, it's a very important distinction to make between influencing and seeking to influence. A lobbyist isn't necessarily successful, but they seek to influence, right? And the caveat here, and this gets to the earlier questions about I have my own constituents that have questions. A lobbyist is generally paid for his or her actions. Okay? Now, there are different types of lobby groups. Different registers throughout the world have classified them. Consultancies is what's regulated by the UK right now, but you also have in-house corporates, you have NGOs, charities, think tanks, professional associations. In terms of who should register, the Canadian experience shows that all of those organizations register. The United States experience also shows that all of those organizations register. It's not simply consultancies. What is the information that you put on in a register? Of course, this is, again, something you can learn from looking at the different bills that exist out there. Generally, I can read to you from Canada, right? So what does an attempt to influence mean? Well, if you try to influence what's referred to as a designated public office holder, which includes ministers, his or her staff, MPs in particular, and high-level civil servants, if you try to communicate, it's an attempt to influence if you try to communicate on any of these things. The development of a legislative proposal by the government or by a bill that's introduced by a single member, the introduction, passage, defeat of any bill, the making or amendment of any regulation, the development or amendment of any policy program, and the awarding of any contract. So you have very clear guidelines in existing legislation of what attempt to influence actually means. So when you register, a lobbyist will have to say, okay, this is what I want to try to influence. This is the bill. This is the specific ministry I want to try to do it with. This is the name of my organization, who all works for it. In some cases, like in the American legislation, you have to put spending disclosures of how much money you've spent. And a very important aspect when I was reading the submissions and even some of the comments that really isn't touched upon is the idea of a cooling off provision or revolving door provision, which basically says that if you're a parliamentarian or a minister in a specific policy area, you cannot work as a lobbyist in that area for a certain amount of time. Okay? That's also a very important key part of any legislation that you'd have to develop.
That's very helpful indeed, and I will read that with close interest when it's in the official report. I think, George, do you wish to come in?
Yes, I do. I just want to go, is it not all about balance? Is it not all about, similar to what Susan Deakin brought up, you know, if you use some of the examples that we've used, minimum pricing and smoking, well, there is a balance there because there's multi-million-pound organisations who are equally paying lobbyists to feed in to get a different answer from what possibly the line the government is going down from a health perspective. So is that balance not there, and it's up to the individual, the MSP as a representative, to make that decision there? And it's not necessarily a case of things that it's just someone going through the decision process as the local elected member for their area. I get a hard time in here because I always say, what's good for Paisley? I'm here to talk about Paisley. You know, but that's an important thing. That's an important part of my job. I believe I'm taking that seriously, and I will use all the information, like Mr. Deacon said, to ensure that I can come to what I believe is the correct decision for my constituents and taking in their point of view. But I go back to the definition point again. You know, when do we stretch into lobbies? When does it become a bureaucratic nightmare? My wife's already texted me when we were changing the panels there to say she does my diary, and for the interests of transparency, can I say she doesn't get paid for it? She's here as a volunteer. But when does she says actually you get another diary now? Now she's just creating another diary just for the sake to tell her the rules. She'll do it. Now when does that become something that's actually helpful and just something we're going to?
System. Sorry, the onus of a registration system is precisely on the lobbyist itself. Right.
I'm talking about the diary. I'm talking about the MSP's diary. There's a question as well: should we actually publish our diaries at one stage as well? And I'm just saying, you know, do we just go through that process and keep everyone happy? And as my wife quite rightly said, there's another diary in your electronic diary. But it's not really giving anything back to the actual process.
Yeah, I guess my comment to that would be that's a fair point. But most registration systems in the world don't require MPs to do that.
Susan?
Can I pick up on a couple of strands that have come out here? First of all, I wholeheartedly agree that the whole practice and concept of balance is a hugely important one to have right centre stage in this kind of discussion, as is proportionality, and I'd urge members to continue to do that. On the issue of international comparisons, again, I'm always passionate about looking at international comparisons, but I'm equally keen that we remember that we're Scotland. We're not England, we're not Austria or Australia, we're Scotland. And we kind of know ourselves pretty well. And we actually spent a lot of time crafting a narrative around the kind of politics that we wanted to have in Scotland and the kind of institutions that we wanted to have in Scotland. And I think, you know, a lot of what I've read in the submissions is talking about a different political system and culture to the one that I know and recognise. So I think we have to be very, very careful about carrying that across. I also think, to come back to some of the points that Robin made earlier, that the last way to build trust and confidence in politicians in the political process is to peddle what frankly I regard as conspiracy theories of all these different evil sort of forces that are around, and then there's some cause and effect relationship then with what politicians do in terms of the laws that they vote for and all this kind of thing. I think that's an absolute nonsense. And, you know, I was asked, when I was invited to come to the committee, I was asked to reflect, you know, from my past experience as an MSP and minister, and I hope if you can give me a minute or two, convener, it might be useful just to share a couple of thoughts that I have on that. Drugs companies have been mentioned a number of times, and I think it's really important that we don't just do the good guy, bad guy thing here, right? And I'll reflect on some things I think I got wrong in the past. When I was health minister, I never ever met with anybody in the pharmaceutical industry. I accepted the advice that was given to me by then officials that that wasn't a good thing to do. It wasn't good to be seen to do that because there was all these big commercial interests there and it wouldn't play very well. And it was for enterprise ministers to meet with these guys and all that kind of thing. I think that was wrong. I think some health ministers subsequently held to that view, and then later, really more as democracy matured or whatever, or just practices changed later. I believe more recently health ministers have met with the pharmaceutical industry, and I think they should. We desperately need to work with the pharmaceutical industry to make sure that the patient, you know, that people and patients get the drugs and the treatments they need and deserve, and that we work together to make sure that the R&D can be supported and that we get them working alongside our universities and so on and so forth. So I think that I got that wrong, and I think that was part of what remains, I think, often a default position in here, which is this kind of, oh, these big commercial interests are big, bad and dangerous and we better not be seen in the same room as them. I think thinking about how we work together is the right thing to do. And I do think it's an insult to the intelligence of politicians to suggest that just because there is information submitted to them from these big commercial organisations, either directly or through, through third-party lobbyists or paid lobbies, whatever, that somehow, as I say, there's some cause and effect relation that we're just going to roll over and go along with that view. I think one of the things that is much more demeaning for this institution and for politicians is when people stand up and speak in debates and people out there know that they're not very well informed, that they haven't actually listened, to a whole range of different views, and they haven't actually thought about how the industry works or whatever. And I wanted to give one other example, can I briefly, which is, I think, one that you'll relate to. Sorry. But this thing, it's all about money. I was reflecting on a sort of big ticket issue from my day. It's a bit historic, but it's still a big ticket issue. Free personal care. And I tell this story slightly against myself as well, because it's a matter of public record that the Parliament did not vote in the way that I, as the then Minister, wanted them to. But I've, in my more recent past, in doing teaching with master's students in public policy, have taken that and worked it up as a case study about what really influenced the outcome of that policy decision. And one of the things, by no means the only, but one of the significant factors or individuals that influenced that was the author of the Commission report, Sir Stuart Sutherland, who happened to, now Lord Sutherland, who happened at that point to be the principal of Edinburgh University, a stone throw away from the Scottish Parliament, and who was, in the best possible sense, all over the Parliament and ministers and civil servants, like a rash in the early days of devolution, to promote that Commission report and to promote its recommendations. Did he have disproportionate access to politicians? Absolutely. Was there anything wrong with that? Absolutely not. Did any money change hands? No, it didn't. And there will always be situations where people, and organisations, sometimes representing views and opinions, sometimes working for organisations or companies, will and it's as it should be, will find their way through the wide doors that this institution has and will make a case. And I come back to what I've said repeatedly. It's then for MSPs to decide. As I say, in that particular instance, I lost. but it was an individual there. It wasn't a big financial interest, but there was nothing wrong with that.
OK, I want to move the session forward a little bit, and Rich is going to open on register of lobbyists, I think.
Yes, basically, I take on board what Professor Susan Deakin had said. In some ways, I agree with most of it. But if there were to be a register, what information should be included in it and why?
Perhaps Robin? I would simply include what the issue is. So you want to know what were they lobbying on. What were a broad outline of the kind of general spend and the programme of the kind of meetings, 4 or 5 meetings. Just a general outline of what you were trying to achieve, what you put in to try to achieve it, and the things that you did to try to achieve it in a fairly small way. Now, the word that I would use is essentially proportionality. I think if you're a small campaigning charity, you're in a completely different category. But for them to say once a year to fill in half a side of A4 that says we're a campaigning charity that campaigns on X, we try to generally influence policy in these areas. Over the coming year, we will hold a series of meetings with politicians, and this is roughly what we think our budget is overall in Send. Now, that's proportionate to them. If you're doing a big campaign, you're trying to influence, I think what you say is, well, this was the general budget for the campaign. Here is the kind of people we're trying to influence. Here are the things that we're trying to achieve. And no more than that. Just that. So that you can look and you can do things like, one of the things that's been said a lot here is there's balance. Great. Let's get the data and let's see if there is balance. Let's see if both sides are spending the same. Let's see if both sides are getting the same number of meetings. You're telling me there's balance. Brilliant. There'll be no problem to have a look at that then and to see if there is balance. So it's simply about being able to make judgments about whether there has been a reasonable and balanced debate with both sides having a reasonable chance. So you want as much data as is possible to give you that picture and no more. It's not about being punitive. It's not about making business difficult for people. It's just about letting other people see how much balance there was.
Okay, so just want to ask, you mentioned spending. Do you think that the spending has to be equal when you're saying for balance? That are you a rich charity or a rich lobbyist or a poor lobbyist?
No, I keep coming back to this again.
What do you mean by that?
I'm saying there should be the capacity to see just that. I say again, it's like it's like if you, at the point at which you were collecting data about difference in pay rates between men and women. You collect the data to see the scale, so that people have the capacity to see the scale of if there is a problem and what it's like. It doesn't mean that by collecting data on differential pay scales between men and women, as it started in the 60s and 70s, that fixed the problem, or that was a statement of the finalised outcome must be X or Y. It's simply to say that when there's things in big public interest, providing a minimum amount of data, a decent amount of data, which enables people to have a look and make their own mind up. Because, I mean, I see again, I have a lot of respect for our elected politicians. I think you do a broadly good job. But that doesn't mean that we have to take, at every occasion, your word that there was always definitely balance. It's only to say that the public might say, you know something, that whole bit there, it did look like one side had more power and more influence than the other, or whatever, so that other people can make judgments. It's only that. It's just about democracy.
Okay, I think we've got that point, Professor.
Okay. I'll just give you what we tried to do is develop a typology of different types of regulatory environments. Okay, so this is directly related to your question of what information should you put on when you register. So in low regulatory environments, a lobbyist has to generally put very little information. And in a medium, you would give a bit more about who you are as a lobbyist and what is it in terms of the bill that you want to try to influence, which is the ministry. So you give a little bit more than low. And in high regulatory systems, you would give all of that information plus financial disclosures on how much you spend. So there are systematic ways that you can do it. You don't necessarily have to do it low. You don't have to do it medium. You don't have to do it high. It all depends what sort of information you feel that your citizens need to see. If you think that citizens want to see spending disclosures, well, follow a high regulatory model. If you think that just the names of who's lobbying who on which bills and which ministries, then follow that as well. What I think is an interesting piece of information to always disclose as a lobbyist is if you were a former public office holder, okay, whether you were a minister or an MP or a high-level civil servant, because when we talk about the cynicism of politics that's held amongst the public, a lot of that has to do with the revolving door issue. So in terms of registration information, I would include that. But there are different pieces of information depending on how tight you want your regulation to be.
About two-thirds of the way through this session, so if we can step up the pace. Margaret.
Thank you, and I will be very brief, convener. I was interested to hear from Professor Chari there on his definition of lobbying. And I think from the previous panel we heard that the devil would be in the detail. And it was really just to get a very brief view from this panel on what they think the definition of lobbying is. I mean, Professor Chari has already given what his definition is. And also how the register would sit alongside the Parliament's founding principles of accessibility, openness, accountability and the sharing of power. If perhaps you could give just a brief insight into your views on that.
Okay. Well, in terms of allowing for accessibility, most of the registers are available online. In fact, all of them in the political systems we've studied, which allows people to access information on who's lobbying who. Now, in some cases, they have to do monthly updates. In the case of Canada, lobbyists have to say, okay, during this month, I've met with this minister or I've met with this high-level civil servant. So people, in terms of being able to see, being able to get the information with regard to accessibility, it's there. And this is precisely because of technology and internet and being able to have access to this. That allows for, then, transparency. And I think it's important to look at the consumers of this information. In terms of the transparency, people now can make informed choices in the next election. If they saw that Minister X was meeting with specific interest groups that they're not happy with, or they didn't meet enough with other interest groups they would have been happy with, well, they can take that information to the voting box and make informed decisions. So in terms of accessibility, transparency, good governance, and open knowledge when it comes to making voting choices, this registration can help. Yeah.
Can I just say that, as you'll have gathered, my starting point is I don't think that a register or legislation is the right way to go. So, and I think it would be a real displacement of energy and activity and, frankly, taxpayers' money to spend a lot of time doing that, when I think there's a number of other things that you could be doing to address the fundamental issue, which is about confidence and trust in politics and good decision-making. And it was interesting, just, Raj touched on the point there about people declaring past interests and so on. And as somebody who, if I live to be 1,000, I think, will always still be a former MSP and minister. You never get away from it. I have no problem about being open with that at all. But I also like to think that people who have served in public office, can actually bring quite a rich dimension to, a lot of discussions around a lot of issues because they've seen both sides and they understand the political process. And I come back to this thing that Scotland's different. Their DNA is different, the way the politics work. Their rules are different. I've been really, really concerned to see, how much the research has been drawn on a lot of submissions of the examples given about Westminster. In Westminster, routinely, and I personally disagree with it, sitting MPs routinely sit on, well-remunerated company boards and the like, and that's part of the thing. It's understood, and there's relatively low levels of transparency around that and stuff like that. This place is entirely different. So I think, I think the high-level aim, if you like, of the institution should be to continue to encourage as much as possible cross-fertilisation of ideas. And I think it's like trying to store water in a shoebox, to try and codify that and commodify that. And forgive me, I come back to George Adam's point that obviously resonated with me when I came in the door earlier. If you go to a garden lobby reception and you get let's say it's something about science education, right, or skills development, you get talking to the HR director of a chemicals company in your constituency, and you spend 15 or 20 minutes talking about their business and finding about how they work, and they tell you things and issues that concern them or things they think government or the council or whatever should be doing. Should they be registered? Are they lobbying? How do they capture that? How do they know the rules? And as for the thing about MSP's diaries, do you go back and do you start putting that in your diary that you've had a meeting with that company? This place was created precisely to create opportunities where those sorts of discussions could happen routinely and openly and be encouraged and developed. And I think we need much, much more of it. So the idea of using time and energy instead to go down the road that other countries and some other countries and cultures have gone down, of trying to capture and, record all of this, to me is just, as I say, I think it's a displacement activity and I think it's the wrong use of time and energy.
Can I say that I think fairly light touch is the key here? I wouldn't be overly worried about too much of definitional stuff. The approach that I would take would be to say to people, if you believe you are a lobbyist, you should register. If you're caught clearly lobbying and you haven't done that, then you might think about sanctions. But I mean, I'd be, as far as I'm concerned, I would just be as happy if people had to fill in a form and it went on a website. No more than that. And that people see, to take that example there, I attended a meeting I attended a reception in the Scottish Parliament with the intention of talking about my business. Next. Now, one of the things that I'm bothered about here is there does seem to be quite a lot of suggestion that this is a weight on you. This is no weight on you. This is not about what you do. You're doing your job in meeting these lobbyists. They're doing their job in meeting you. You already live up to a large number of rules and regulations. You have a high standard. This is a high standard parliament. All we're suggesting is a little bit of that burden goes on the other side. Now, it doesn't have to be expensive. It doesn't have to involve... I wouldn't have an extensive compliance regime. It would be very, very difficult to go in and say, actually, you spent, twice as much as you said you did. But in the early days, again, it's about getting the information out there so that people can look and see the picture, the state of the picture. It's just that. People do not understand how lobbying works or how much of it there is. To give that picture does not mean that we have to have policemen standing over your shoulder the whole time, making sure that you didn't talk to somebody. It's about saying to the other side, look, you do this full-time as a business, or you do this as a serious part of your business. Just tell us about it. Just tell us a little bit about the basics about what you do.
Bring Cameron in, who I think's maybe got...
I just have, actually, most of my questions have been answered, but I have one particular question, which is for Professor Raj. I noticed that in BC, you say that there should be a mandatory review of the LRA every 5 years, like what we call a sunset clause. Do you think that's we should have this, reviewing the lobbying registration? Yeah. Do you think that's a good idea?
I don't think it's once it's set up, once a registration system is set up, it's normal for different jurisdictions to make amendments to them. Canada's Federal is probably the best example. It came in force in 1989. They saw loopholes in the legislation. In 1995, they made amendments, and that came with another set of amendments in 2003, 2008. So it's normal to have a review, whether it's mandatory or not. I think that might be up to whichever political system to decide. But to see how it's functioning and if there are things that could go better or things that maybe were not working well. I think it's a good thing, yeah.
Does a mandatory review, the advantage of a mandatory review is it focuses people's mind after 3 or 4 years, gosh, we're going to have a review of this, whether it's good or bad. Whereas if otherwise it can slip away. That's what I was thinking.
Yeah, sure. If you want to institute, I guess the political systems that have enacted them that have what I refer to as high and medium regulation generally do the review, even if it's not stipulated in the legislation that it's mandatory. European Transparency Register, for example, had a review of the Commission's 2008 initiative. It's wanting in several dimensions. We can get into that if you want, but they did make changes to it in 2011 as well. So, yeah.
Thank you, Convener. I think that's questions.
Looking at the questions we've got before us, I suspect we've covered most of the things. Are there other things, Richard, and a question, please?
I asked the other panel most of the factor of transparency that Professor Susan Deakin goes on about is that most companies come in here to organisations, charities, Scotland for Marriage, for instance, etc., come in and ask MSPs to put forward amendments to bills. Are they the lobbyists? And would that then stop MSPs putting forward amendments, or would the factor that it would reduce the amount of amendments that are being put forward to bills? That sometimes these amendments can actually aid a bill, help a bill, or bring items into debate. What's your view on that?
Lobbying is really important. It's an important part of democracy. Nobody is suggesting that anybody should be stopped from doing anything whatsoever. I don't think anyone's even suggesting there should be any action that takes place that is likely to disincline somebody to do something. All we're saying is that there should be some proportionate capacity to know what was done. And so, for example, if you take any of those, say those large civic campaigns, I think that the regime that I would like to see, I think it would be encouraged, would be to say, you're about to engage in a campaign. Fill in a side of A4, half a side of A4. This is the things that we will be doing. Again, proportionate. They're not a commercial lobbying company who do this every day, all day for pay. They're coming in once or twice on a specific issue. Now, I think it would be very easy for them just to say simply, in the same way that, just now, the campaigns are being asked to just say, are you involved in the independence referendum? OK, you've just got to say yes or no, and then just roughly how much are you spending? Just that as a way of making sure that the systems are free. So nobody should be prevented or discouraged from lobbying. That's not the purpose of this. It's only about being able to let people see the system, how it works. So it's not about prohibiting. And if it has anything whatsoever to do with changing behaviour, that is something which would come once we've seen the picture. So I'm not saying anything has to change, because I can promise you, I don't know the picture of lobbying in Scotland. I can guarantee you that the stuff that I was doing as a lobbyist, you wouldn't have been aware of 90% of what I was doing. You would have no idea how much I'd spent when I was doing that. You would have no idea how many people I involved or who I lobbied to lobby you, all those sorts of things. You wouldn't know any of that stuff. I certainly don't know that about what's being done in lobbying campaigns that I'm seeing just now in the Scottish Parliament. I have no idea how much money or how many hours have been spent. So it's just that. It's just about being able to say to people, there you go. Maybe this data comes out and we say, that's reassuring, everything's fine. That's good. And you keep it there. Just routinely, simply keep it there, and then everything's fine. Or maybe it comes out and you say, wow, we did not know so much was being spent trying to influence decisions in this direction or in that direction. And then you might say to yourself, do we perhaps need to support the other side to give them a little bit of balance? For example, maybe the other side just doesn't have the resource, and we need to find a way to let them have an equal voice. This is particularly the case if you have communities campaigning against corporations on maybe local issues, open cast mining or something like that. In a case like that, you might look and you might say, this data suggests to us as a committee that while we've listened to both sides, one side hasn't had as much capacity to prepare for us, and therefore maybe we'll give them an extra session. Something like that, I don't know. But the point being is only after you see the data that you know what it is that you might want to do.
Right, I think we've got Susan.
I respond directly to Mr Lyle's point there. I think it would be a crying shame if people, and I use that word in the broadest possible sense, whether it's the local mums group that I know was referred to in the previous section. I'm very passionate about people listening well to local mums groups, or whether it be the big corporate. I think it would be a real crying shame if people started worrying away about whether or not they are or are not lobbyists, whether they should or should not register, and if that starts to affect and skew and distort behaviour in terms of their ability and willingness to engage with the Parliament and parliamentarians in the parliamentary process. And I'm going to say something here about the business world. I spend a lot of my time, and I have done it, particularly since I left the Parliament, and particularly my life in the academic world, actually trying to encourage and to foster better connections between business, policy and academia. And, you know, one of the reasons why a lot of businesses employ lobbyists, or paid lobbyists is the phrase that's around, a public affairs company, I suppose, to give them their Sunday names, is because they actually don't, an awful lot of them don't have an awful lot of knowledge and capacity about how to relate to that world. A lot of civic society is very confident and actually has a lot of capacity in how to engage with the political and public policy world, not least given the nature of the responsibilities of a devolved Scottish Parliament. And they've become very skilled at it in a good way, you know, over the years, and knowing how to come to things like the Public Petitions Committee and the likes, and knowing how to get access to local MSPs. And so you'd be surprised how many businesses actually, because they don't live in that world, and they maybe don't, you know, have regular contact and the like, that when there is an issue around it affects their industry or whatever, and they recognise there's a need in some way for them to, you know, throw into the mix their views and concerns or whatever, they don't know how, and therefore they hire somebody to do it. You know, and I think sometimes that's presented as that's some awful illegitimate thing to do, and it contaminates it because money changes hand. You know, I think as a soften the way of things, you know, these things should not be seen in black and white. A phrase I used to like a lot, but it's been a bit hijacked in another way, is shades of grey. I think we need to see these things in shades of grey, you know, and I think you're in terrain here which has multiple shades of grey, and therefore to attempt, therefore, to take a kind of black and white solution would be wrong. Some people have said, you know, it's us on the record, can't remember who, people have used the phrase, is this a sledgehammer to crack a nut? I don't think that's the right metaphor. I think it's like taking a screwdriver to change a light bulb thing. You know, we're dealing with two different things here. You know, and as I say, if the aim and the aspiration of this Parliament is to encourage openness and access and a free flow of information and to build understanding, then the last thing you want is people worrying away about how they're labelled and whether they've complied with the rules before they come and they speak to politicians.
As we come to conclusions, maybe just a couple of little things that briefly might seek answers on. If there is to be a registration system, should there be thresholds below which registration is not required? And should there be exemptions for people who, or organisations who don't have to register, in your views? Starting with Robin, briefly, please.
Just go for time. I would just go.
You can see the clock.
Yeah, I would just go for proportionality. Rather than saying there's exemptions, I would just say if you're small and you don't do it very often, just put in a few sentences. Just put it on a register. And if you're big and you do it more often, you do more of it. So I would say it's more about proportionality than it's about exemptions, because then you're just having to draw arbitrary lines somewhere and it becomes endlessly complicated.
Professor Raj?
The issue of thresholds with regard to time was visited in the United States legislation as well as the Canadian, where it's, roughly speaking, the rule was if you spend less than 20% of your time lobbying, you don't need to register. Problematic, however, because who's going to verify that and how could that ever be falsified? When you have thresholds of time, such as 20%, or thresholds of I spend X amount of money on trying to lobby, the very difficult thing is that even an independent regulator might not be able to verify that. I would stay away from thresholds precisely because they can be used, they can be considered loopholes in a system. So I would definitely not consider thresholds if it was part of my legislation. In terms of exemptions, it's also very dangerous to grant exemptions as well, because, and in fact, if you look at the narrow definition of lobbyists in the UK case, right now, looking only at consultants, you actually effectively have exempt a whole variety of in-house corporates, NGOs, etc., who are effectively lobbyists, but they're exempt. And this creates an unlevel playing field, and it shows that some lobbyists are different than others, and they might be different public goods that they have in mind, but lobbyists that attempt to seek to influence are all lobbyists, all the same, whether they're your corporates or whether they're your NGOs.
Deacon?
I think you're back to trying to take a tape measure to something that's not measurable.
Okay, right. Just before we close then, 100 words or none from each of you just on any subjects we haven't covered. We don't need to restate what we've already heard, but if there are gaps in our questioning that you would like to just draw our attention to, starting with Robin, and 100 words.
I mean, it is only a restatement. Lobbying works. Lobbying is the spending of money to get outcomes that work for you. People who lobby get return for their lobbying. That's why people spend hundreds of millions of pounds doing it. Lobbying does work, and democracy will be better if people can simply see it in operation.
Two things that I would like to see this committee turn its time, energy and resource to, instead of unnecessary and I think almost unnecessary legislation and a very difficult legislative process if you do decide to go down that route. One is, as I said earlier, looking at the existing code of conduct and things like legislation of members' interests and working hard to make sure that it really is embedded in the institution and the practices of members. I think that would be very real, very practical, and I think would genuinely contribute to the issue of trust and confidence. Second, can I suggest there's a need for more research in Scotland about how people view the political process? As I said earlier, far too many of the references that I've seen are to the Westminster system. And I think this Parliament needs a better evidence base to know what the public are really feeling and what their experience and perceptions are of this institution, given they've now had quite a bit of experience of it. And I think that would be really, really helpful for the public to have access to that, and I think it would really inform the work of this committee now and in the future.
Very quickly, the international experience shows that increasingly countries and political systems are adopting lobbying regulation. There were 4 in the 1900s. That's tripled by today. If there's a will to pursue legislation and it's deemed necessary, it certainly would be consistent with what many political systems in the world are doing. And I guess the final word is, from those political systems, it's very easy to draw policy lessons from them and to take their legislations and their experiences and use them when you're drafting your bill.
Can I thank the panel members very much for the contribution? Lively, interesting, engaging and diverse, and that's probably quite useful. And I'm sure you will inform our future consideration of this subject. Thank you once again. Briefly suspend the meeting. We'll resume the meeting with agenda item 4, which is for the committee to consider changes to standing orders. The convener of the Finance Committee wrote to the committee to consider how the financial provisions of the Scotland Act 2012 should be translated into standing orders. The Scotland Act contained various financial provisions which will require to be reflected in the Scottish Parliament budget process. I invite the committee to consider how the Scotland Act financial provisions can be translated into standing orders, specifically to consider and agree proposed standing orders rule change which are in Annex B, and to seek confirmation that the Finance Committee is content with the changes. Are we agreed? Agree to consider a report on the rule changes in private at a future meeting of the committee. Are we agreed? Yes. Agree to seek a chamber debate to approve the rule changes on the same date as the proposed Finance Committee debate, seeking approval for the written agreement. Are we agreed? Yes. We agreed. Thank you very much. That ends the public part of this meeting, and we move into private session.